The sky had not been blue in years. When I wake, it's the same bruised color, a low, copper haze that presses the world flat and makes the sun look like a dim, dishonest coin. You learn to read weather by smell now, ozone before a heat surge, charred pine when a new fire line eats a ridge, that sweet, sour rot when a reservoir finally gives up and the shoreline collapses into sludge. The planet keeps its warnings in scents and creaks. We listen because the instruments are mostly dead. Where I broadcast from used to be 2 blocks from the river. Now the river is a throat of cracked clay and salt, the bed a white knife. Boats rotted where they keeled over, half buried in dust in the high summer and half buried in mud the rest of the year when the sky finally decided to remember rain, but no one could trust it. Bridges hang like broken ribs. The downtown skyline is a jagged sentence, windows blown out, signs flayed away by wind and flame. You can walk through malls that used to sell happiness and hear only the whisper of paper coupons caught in skeletal escalators. Somewhere under all that, the transit tunnels sag and breathe like old animals. On bad nights, the city exhales a wind that sounds almost human. Storms stopped being regular. They came like punishments. Heat waves baked neighborhoods into their own shadows. Streets melted and the blacktop curled like dead skin. When the monsoon remembered how to fall, it did so with teeth, sudden, violent floods that overturned the little order that remained, drowned gardens in oil and debris, and left whole blocks smelling like batteries. Wildfires became calendars, a wall of orange that ate everything for a week, then moved on as if bored. The forests remember how to burn. We remember how to run. The climate was the opener, but it was the collapse of systems that finished the job. Government offices still stood because brick resists time, but the people inside had long since left or been taken. Law became a rumor. My first broadcast was an attempt to stitch a map back together with sound frequencies, a way to say I'm here, and hope someone elsewhere could say me too. Sometimes they do. Often they don't. Survivor groups arrange themselves around what they can hoard or make useful. There are the keepers who hold water like priesthoods, charging passage or favor for a single bottle. There are the tinkers, people who still remember how to coax power from old engines and broken solar panels, trading light for mechanical skill. Raiders run in packs, and they prefer the moon for attacking because shadows are sharper then. In between are the radio nests. Tiny communities clustered around a transmitter, a generator, someone who knows Morse or can patch a caller through. We are small islands of signal in a sea of static. Institutions that used to command respect have been gutted and repurposed. Universities are now seed banks or vaccine vaults, if the seed stocks survive the humidity and the rodents. Hospitals are for the lucky or the rich. The field clinics run by volunteers and exhausted med students are where the rest go, trading stitches for canned corn. Churches became warehouses of stories and canned peaches. Some are fortresses. Police stations are either empty shells or occupied by factions that read their badges like relics, not authority. Corporate headquarters sit as monuments to a time when numbers mattered more than water. There's a strange geography to what's left. Coastal cities that once mattered are bordered now by salt flats and eroding sea walls. Inland, rivers that carved civilizations now mark the distance between habitability and ruin. The suburbs turned into patchwork farms, where people try to coax tomatoes out of contaminated soil with filters and prayer. Out beyond the highways, the world opens into places that look like moonscapes. Cracked lakebeds, rusting factories, telephone poles leaning like old men. Occasionally you'll find a town that hangs together, a market square with a water pump, a fence, a watchtower. Those places survive because their people agreed to watch one another's backs, to trade fairly, to bury their dead within sight. Those are the places that get tested first. Nature, stubborn and clinical, adapts in ways that make my hands shake. The insects change their calendar. Migratory birds arrive thin and frantic, then disappear. New molds bloom in old refrigerators. The air tastes of iron and old batteries at night. The dead, I don't mean the dead of disease or famine, but the things we thought we'd left behind drift back. The virus that turned human desperation into animal hunger runs loose in whispers and rumors. Sometimes you hear the clatter of a scavenged vehicle and know it's either traitors or trouble. People learn to mark their roofs with symbols, stripes, a circle, a radio band frequency, little beacons that say who you are and whether you're friend or meal. What keeps us moving is small and stubborn. A rain barrel, a functioning pump, a cache of wheat rescued from a flooded warehouse. These are epics now. We've become archivists of what mattered, preserved seeds, printed lists of which antibiotics worked last summer, a battered manual on how to desalinate in the desert. I keep my microphone because voice is a currency. It travels farther than a convoy, and it costs less than a shoebox of bullets. When I speak, I thread names across the wasteland, places, people, safe frequencies, and sometimes the thread holds. Fear is the weather inside us. It storms and clears, but it never leaves. We plan in contingency, rationed meals, pre-buried stashes, signals at dawn. Anxiety sits at the edge of every conversation like static, and under that nervous hum is something that feels like waiting. Waiting for water to fail, waiting for a new faction to roll through, waiting for the world to show its next trick. We are always listening, not because we expect comfort, but because we are still hoping for company. This is the world I wake into, the world I point my mic at when the generator finally coughs awake. It is unforgiving and brutally honest. It will not be tamed, but it still has mornings where the light is thin enough to read by, where someone down the line laughs at a joke that is more grief than humor, and where for a breath we imagine that the copper sky might one day go back to blue. I am the voice that comes through when the night tightens its grip and the generator wheezes into life. Call sign, Station K9. No one remembers the original meaning anymore, just that it's the frequency people tune to when they want to know whether someone is still breathing on the other side of the static. When I first pressed my hand to the mic, I thought of it as a last, useless habit, someone keeping a radio warm like a dying stove. Now it's the thing that keeps me honest. Before the collapse, I had reasons like anyone else. A job, bills, a daughter who drew sons with too many rays, and a wife who laughed with her whole face. Those things are names I practice in the dark, so they don't dissolve completely. I say them out loud sometimes during broadcasts, as if the airwaves can hold memory the way jars hold preserves. Names are stubborn things. They outlast smoke and rot. Survival is a ledger of small victories and bitter losses. I live in a building that once ate the lives of people in 9-to-5 shifts and vomited them back out again on payday. The lobby is a field now, seedlings in cracked tile, and my room sits at the back, where the wind is less curious. There's a pedal generator rigged to keep the transmitter alive when the sun hides and the worn solar cells don't want to remember their job. I can turn my bicycle into a power source if I need to. My legs are paid in watt hours and memory. Maintaining the rig is half science and half superstition. I keep a notebook, oil-stained pages with diagrams, measurements, and swear words. It's the closest thing I have to a prayer book. Water is the currency that makes or breaks a person. I keep a quarter cistern under tarps, buried as much as secrecy will allow, lined with scavenged plastic and clay. Rain catchment is a ritual. We sweep the roofs, patch holes with strips of tarp, and the learned patience of people who understand how a drip can speak of survival. When the monsoon remembers to fall, we funnel it into tanks, strain it through cloth, and hold it next to charcoal. We boil for certainty when we can spare the fuel. When bleach is all we have, we measure it with the same care a surgeon uses. There are no miracles, only attention and repetition. Food is a perimeter we defend. I barter words for cans, stories for sacks of grain. The community that calls my frequency is small. Rosa, the tinkerer who keeps the pumps from dying. Malik, who knows gun barrels and how to blind a man's sight with a glare. An old math teacher named June who counts days the way some people count rosaries. We trade labor and knowledge. We rotate watch. We bury the dead together. That train of barter keeps the roof from falling in. Scavenging is a choreography of risk. We move at dawn, light low and forgiving. I have paths memorized, schoolyards where canned goods hide in submerged lockers, pharmacies where the glass is mostly intact, industrial sites with solar panels that no one bothered to take. My hands have learned the difference between useful and useless. I can tell a battery's life by weight, a pump's condition by the sound it sweeps out when you spin it. The world taught me to listen not only for voices, but for the thin mechanical laments of things that can be coaxed to life. People ask why I stay. Why hold a radio when you could walk north where rumors say the water is better, where a city is rebuilding around a lake? The answer is stitched to the collar of every broadcast. Someone might be listening. Responsibility grows into purpose. There are callers who have no other line to humanity. The old man who lost his hands in a flooded mill and still remembers the names of the presidents. The teenage girl who sings plaintive hymns at night and can still tune a guitar to the right pitch. I am a spool. I pull a thread through the dark so others can find one another. I tell locations, I warn of raiders, I pass messages. We have 2 jars of powdered milk, barter for tools, and it matters. There are nights when the voice breaks. There are nights when the static fills the room like snow, and I have to close my eyes and let the memory wash. I carry the weight of decisions made in the absence of options. Once, when the river was more river than mud, a convoy passed with children, enough to break a man into pieces made of tenderness and helplessness. We argued about taking them in, about how to feed them, about whether bringing them here would make a den for raiders to find. In the end, we left them to a village that promised safety. The village burned that night. I heard about it over a crackling transmission an hour later, a voice gone high and small with shock. That news is a stone I carry in the chest. I have nightmares where the kids are behind the transmitter, pressing their small faces to the mesh, and I turned away to spool another message. Guilt is a living thing here. It eats at the edges of sleep. Love is not a metaphor. It's a rationed resource. When I tell the story of my wife, I do it carefully because the memory is fragile. She died of a fever that took everyone in our block faster than the med kits could be distributed. The memory of her sleeping on the couch with our daughter curled under her arm is a photograph I consult like a map. I think of her often when I tune the frequency. Sometimes I read letters she left that begin with, "If the worst comes," as though writing prepared her for the unthinkable. My daughter is a name whispered into the wind. I have a small cardboard box of her drawings, edges singed, colors still bright because children have an audacity to pigment that fire cannot quite bleach away. I speak of them on air, not as spectacle but as reminder. This was what we had, this is what we fight to remember. The body betrays as surely as the weather. My left hand doesn't open quite right after a broken finger mended crooked. My knees complain like old men when the dust rolls in. I have scars, small maps of poor decisions and sharp luck. Disease here is opportunistic. It favors the worn. We have improvised treatments, jars of tinctures and makeshift bandages. June keeps a list of symptoms and remedies in a ledger with tabs and elastic. We trade antibiotics like they're family heirlooms, and sometimes they are. Trust hangs by a hair. People are tired of being taken. There are those who treat trust like a currency to be spent once and never again. I learned to watch hands as much as faces. When someone offers a trade, I watch their eyes while Malik counts the goods. We test the sincerity of offers with small favors. A can of beans for a story, a tune, a promise to watch a rooftop at dawn. Trust is built in increments or not at all. What keeps me moving beside duty is hope, but not the wide, blinding hope of headlines. It's a smaller, pocket-sized thing. A rumor of a working pump 3 valleys over. A caller who remembers a strain of wheat that resists the blight. A laugh shared over a cup of boiled water that tastes like survival. Hope arrives in the form of other people's persistence. When someone on the line says, "We made it through another storm," the syllables anchor me like a bolt. Sometimes hope is a piano key found in a church. Sometimes it's a well that pours clean and makes everyone weep. We collect these small salvations and string them on a line like laundry. Sometimes I pretend I am still the same person I was before the sky turned copper. It's a lie that keeps me human. I tell jokes I don't feel because laughter is contagion worth practicing. I read the weather aloud and explain how to test a battery and sing a song for the lost. My voice becomes a tool, soft when a caller confesses a terror, loud when I need to startle away despair. The microphone gives me a shape to throw myself into. It defines actions so guilt doesn't. I have a ritual before every broadcast. I check the generator oil, test the antenna's angle, wipe the dust from the mic, and touch the cardboard box of my daughter's drawings. Then I press record and say, "This is K9. If you can hear me, speak your name." It's an invitation and an oath. The reply doesn't always come, but sometimes it does. A whisper from a farm 50 miles away. A woman who answers with a laugh and the news that her garden is sprouting. A child who asks if I remember how to whistle. Those voices are my ledger of why I continue. Because where there is another voice, there is possibility. The apocalypse has taught me that being alive is not merely survival of the body. It's the stubbornness to preserve story, to keep the small, human litany of names and jokes and recipes and faults. It's the auditory architecture of a civilization built from radio waves instead of brick. I keep the transmitter warm because stories make a scaffolding on which people can climb out of their fear. When I tell the world that someone's roof has a flare, someone else comes with a ladder. When I mention a baby's name, someone listens and promises to remember. I am tired in ways no clock can capture. Other days I am fierce as a weather front. Mostly I am ordinary, an exhausted keeper of signals. The scars and the losses are a map I carry. The radio is my plow and my pillow. I speak, and sometimes, against the static, the world answers. That is why I do not leave. That is why I keep pedaling when the sun hides, and why I count breaths the way an accountant counts coins. It is not heroism. It is habit, duty, and the small stubbornness of someone who refuses to be the last voice. They told us the sky would give warning in the old days, models, gauges, alerts you got on a phone that still knew how to talk to satellites. Now the warnings come in the way the horizon folds. A heat shimmer that doesn't quit. A low pressure that feels like a hand pressing on your chest. The first cough of a dust front like someone wheezing miles away. The crisis that keeps us awake is not one thing. It is a conspiracy of things that feed each other. Drought ate the rivers. Heat baked the soils that held memory. Fires swept the hills and left ash where forests used to be. When the climate broke its long patience, everything else followed. The dead were only the last bell. The timeline is a straight collapse if you look at it close enough. Winters got thinner. Summers went on too long. Rain came without rhythm. Where rivers used to be wide and slow, you could now walk across their ribs and hear the earth sigh. The aquifers that sustained towns for generations were pumped dry because infrastructure that could have slowed the drawdown, long-term water policy, maintenance, reservoirs, had been starved of attention and dollars. Farms turned brittle. The soil flipped from sponge to dust. As groundwater dropped, wells began to taste old salt and new metals. Taste was the first clue. Crops failed in a pattern we called the triple stress: heat, drought, and pests. Pests adapted. Crops did not. Markets failed. Spirits followed. Heat creates its own weather. The sun baked the ground until the air itself became an oven, thick and unforgiving. Thermals rose and tore the air into violent storms that had no precedent. A dry thunderstorm, lightning without much rain, could crown a ridge with fire in minutes. Those fires, once started, burned hotter and longer because the fuel was drier than any of the fire plans assumed. The smoke settled into cities like a second permanent dusk, and in that dusk, all the things that rot and mold found new life. Mold takes advantage of heat and stagnation. Pathogens hitch rides on ash. That is when the sickness that turned desperate people into something else started to spread. Not because it arrived fully formed, but because the conditions were right. Crowded shelters, weakened immune systems, and water fouled by runoff from scorched earth that had never been designed to handle the chemical cocktail released by burning infrastructure. Science will tell you about feedback loops. We learned the term in lecture hall days, words like albedo, evapotranspiration, permafrost, as abstractions. Here, feedback loops are living things. With less vegetation, the land reflects less sunlight and absorbs more heat. The air warms, evaporation increases, the clouds change. Rainfall patterns shift away from the places that used to count on them. Ice that once held methane in check melted, and methane is a noisy greenhouse. Rivers that fed cities now slither like wounded animals across a landscape that used to be predictable. Once those systems started to cascade, our plans, municipal, national, sensible, were all written in ink on wind. Survival is getting harder because the inputs we rely on grow scarcer each day. Water is the obvious metric. We ration in milliliters and in habits. Our cisterns are full only when we catch more than we use. That happens rarely. Fuel is the next domino. Generators keep radios and pumps alive, but fuel must be scavenged, refined, or replaced by knowledge about solar rigs and batteries. Batteries degrade in heat. Solar panels get buried in ash or shattered by hailstorms the size of fists. Food systems, long supply chains full of refrigeration and precision timing, collapsed into local scavenging and trial gardens that work only with the mercy of weather. Medicines disappear faster than they can be grown. Talents become currency. Someone who can fix a pump or suture a wound is as valuable as a barrel of water. We are, by habit and by geography, unequal. Places that were rich keep a brittle advantage until resentment and theft whittle it away. Factions form in the ways human beings always do, around resources. The keepers, tinkers, raiders, you know the names. I've broadcast their movements. The keepers hoard wells like monasteries hold relics. They trade guarded access with favors and demands. The tinkers stealth their way into old infrastructure to coax life out of dead machinery. Raiders sow terror, then take what they want. And then there are the gray hands, people who used to be municipal workers and who now claim authority because they kept one pump running for a decade. Authority without legitimacy is a volatile brew. It boils over into raids, into checkpoints, into triage for the living and the dead. My community felt the crisis as a slow constriction, then a sharp cut. The creak of the pump had been our heartbeat. When that pump coughed twice and then refused to spin, we realized the diesel cache that Malik swore a week ago was smaller than anyone thought. We tried to stretch it, siphoned and rationed, timed the generator for night use only, but the pump needed new seals, and the store of spare parts had been raided 2 towns over. That night the radios lit up with voices, people asking for help, others offering strange trades, a goat for a set of spark plugs, a child's violin for a battery. The following afternoon, smoke bloomed on the horizon. Raiders had taken advantage of the diversion. They moved like a shadow through the ash and took the remaining diesel. We chased them and lost ground. Encounters with other survivors have the same rhythm as weather. Sometimes they arrive as rain and sometimes as lightning. There are those we trade with caravans with patched trailers and polite faces. There are those who test us, a man with a smile like an offered blade who asks too many questions. There are those who ask for sanctuary and bring plague. We learn to verify quickly. Signal checks, small favors, a barter for proof. Leave the child with us for a day and we'll show you the seam where the wells are. We used to be naive about trust. No more. When the raiders came through last spring, they took a roof, a harvest, and with it 2 of our best watchmen. They left a note, a crude map burned into cloth that showed the signature of someone who knew how to intimidate without staying. Raiders prefer the night because anonymity is currency, but storms give them a hand. They ambush when the world is distracted. There's an added wrinkle, the sickness. I do not pretend to be a doctor, but I have listened to enough transmissions and tended enough fevered foreheads to see a pattern. People weakened by heat and hunger are easier hosts for pathogens. The first cases looked like fever and confusion. Then there were nights when the fevered rose from triage beds not to wander, but to wander and come back wrong. We called them the walking sick in the first desperate attempt at humor. That nomenclature stuck and then became something darker. The disease doesn't work like a movie. It cripples, confuses, and sometimes burns the edges of cognition down until the person is a different animal with old skin. We learned containment the way birds learn to migrate. Instinct, repetition, rituals. Quarantine was an ugly, necessary tool. Sometimes it saved people. Sometimes it saved the rest of us at the cost of someone we loved. Resources limit action in every way. Fuel scarcity means we choose when to run the generator, and that choice is often the difference between listening for a raid and missing the warning. Water scarcity means we cannot afford to clean every wound properly, and infections start at the edge of the bandage. Food scarcity means we are weaker, and weakness invites disease and predation. Repair parts are rarer than bullets in some places. Even time becomes a resource. The hours you spend mending a pump are hours you don't spend scouting for seeds. These limitations force decisions that are surgical in cruelty. Help one group and leave another to their fate. Repair the pump or teach another to do it. Deliver medicine to a friend, or send it to a community that could turn it into multiples. I try to explain when people ask. The mechanics because knowledge is a kind of shelter. The temperature swings we endure are not just hot days. They are heat anomalies that stress infrastructure designed for a different decade. When concrete goes through repeated cycles of scorching and freezing, it fractures. When a pipeline carries hotter water than it was designed for, seals fail. When reservoirs dip below intake levels, the pumps start to cavitate and die. Salts move in with the low water and etch metal. Solar arrays with microfractures lose efficiency. Insects that used to have life cycles timed to old seasons now arrive out of phase and eat the last of the crops. The science is cold and exact when you can name it, but naming it does not mend the pump or boil the last liter. Actionable steps are thus both technical and human. On the technical side, we learn to harvest dew by running plastic sheeting over a frame at night and collecting droplets slow but reliable when humidity cooperates. We built improvised solar trackers so panels could catch more sun when storms were intermittent. We learned to switch loads, run the transmitter and one pump, not both, in low supply times. We practiced water conservation techniques, gray water for gardens after minimal filtering, mulching to keep soil from baking, and using slow siphon systems that don't gulp what little water remains. We learned to repair by substitution. A gasket from an old truck used as a pump seal, a bicycle chain for a belt drive. Knowledge sharing became our most valuable export. When a caravan with a welder arrived, they were paid not in food but in schematics and the promise of radio time to broadcast their instructions. We traded blueprints like gold. On the human side, we formalized watches and signals, because organization buys days. We rehearsed evacuation routes and coded our messages so a call didn't reveal more than necessary. I set up a panic patch, a short burst of signal at prearranged intervals that lets someone know we are under immediate threat, and the network answers if they can. We established barter fairs at points equidistant from rival territories to reduce confrontation. We created a short, simple triage protocol and taught it on air. How to check for dehydration, how to dress a wound when bandages are thin, when to seek a healer. None of these are cures. They are triage and delay, a way to keep a community whole long enough to find the next small salvation. But all plans have friction. The storm that came last month had a chemical underbelly runoff from burned industrial compounds that made water taste metallic and left sticky residues in the gutters. It sterilized what little green we had left in days. The rains that should have saved us brought new problems, contamination and mud that clogged pumps. We lost a harvest to flooded root beds. That same week, the raiders learned to pick the locks of our fuel cache. Scarcity sharpens arithmetic into cruelty. You always feel like you are choosing between two bad futures. Sometimes the crisis behaves like a test. Will a rumor about a spring be true? And if it is, can you get to it before someone else? Sometimes it behaves like a trap. The spring is guarded by a group that counts guns faster than water. The moral calculus is brutal. If you share what you have and invite others in, you risk the stability of your community. If you bar the gates and hoard, you may survive but lose the other thing that makes surviving worth anything, the humanity of sharing. I have sat up nights making lists. Do we fix the pump or go to the spring? Do we spend our last bullets on when the raiders come or on learning how to desalinate whatever salty trick we can coax from the estuary? Each choice rewrites tomorrow. Each inaction is a vote for an outcome. So we move in small salvations and large gambles. We tuck away seed strains that might survive the new heat, trade knowledge with distant callers about how to graft heat-resistant rootstocks, and hold round-robin training sessions over the radio when the generator runs. We have a tally of successes: a repaired pump, a baby born in a fortified room, a trader who brought a manual on filtration. Those successes do not erase the creeping sense that the next crunch of scarcity could be the one we cannot absorb. The crisis is not a headline. It is 1,000 quiet deaths and the way the living rearrange themselves around that loss. It's the sound of a pump failing in the night and the choices you make before dawn. It is the day a rumor of clean water becomes a promise, and the day after, when the promise is tested by men with guns. It is the calculus of survival writ into sleepless schedules and rationed kindness. It presses and prods, and through the pressure you learn what matters. The parts that keep machines alive, the names of people who matter, the songs that keep you human. I speak of this on air because words make a map. I give a warning about a fire line, or a set of coordinates for a seam of salvage, or the simple instruction: boil your water when in doubt. People tune in because in the dark, in the furnace of a broken climate, a voice with a map is a lighthouse. We cannot stop the feedback loops alone. We can only slow them, delay them, and resist the edge where compassion becomes impossibility. That is the crisis we live inside. A world reshaped by heat and neglect, with people doing the best they can with the tools left, and the stubborn work of holding one another in the static. The dust kept its own calendar that season, a slow, grinding count of days that wore everything down. It settled on my jaw like ash, in the keys of the transmitter, under the rubber of my bicycle pedals. Each layer felt like another small debt we owed the world. Pay it with attention, with maintenance, with the ritual of cleaning and scraping, or let it compound until something vital seized. The watch list had grown shorter. Water, fuel, medicine. Those items lived above all other concerns. Food came and went in cycles of barter and luck. The cistern held less each week. The measurement stick near the tank, a painted dowel, creaked like an old man when I leaned on it and told me what I already knew. We were bleeding ounces. The garden wanted more water than the sky would give, and the seedlings we'd coaxed through last winter were knuckled and thin. The heat took the fat from everything, from crops, from morale, from the easy, careless confidence people once had. On the air I hid worry with recipes and fix-it segments. If your pump sputters, try this, I'd say, and then walk a caller through a gasket replacement with the voice of a teacher. Practicality steadied people. Practicality steadied me. But there are things you cannot talk around. The diesel that used to make our generator sing had a half-life and a history of theft. We kept a log of when it was used and why, and still the needle on the gauge slipped toward empty. We started to schedule the transmitter for the coldest hours, when the chemical action of fuel made it cough less, and the night's lower temperatures stretched what remained. There's a shame to rationing speech as if it were a resource, but we did. Raiders learned to read our rhythms the way hawks read field mice. They are not elegant. They don't parade with flags. They come in the shape of necessity and malice mixed together. Men with sunburned foreheads and bandana mouths. Women whose eyes had calcified into a kind of determination you either trade with or die by. They scouted on dirt bikes, carried with them the kind of bluntness that ends lives quickly and moves on. The first raid that bent us wasn't violent in the way headlines imagine. They came during a windstorm as if the storm were their accomplice, and they took our battery bank and 2 jerry cans of diesel. They left a child's toy behind, a red plastic horse cracked in half, as if to remind us that they too carried lives with them when they left. We chased them. We are slow. We are careful. We have to be. Malik wanted to run at night with a flash and fire, but June counseled patience. We tracked by the ruined signs the raiders left, napalm scars in the brush from a cooking stove, an old soft drink crate repurposed as a cache marker, and found their camp a day's march away. They traded some of the loot for bullets and moved the rest north. We found the battery casings drained of usefulness, the diesel gone. We walked back with empty hands and new names to add to the list of losses. Encounters with other survivors were rarer and tempered by suspicion. Trade caravans navigated routes with flags and avoiding patterns. Sometimes we met them at a prearranged midpoint and swapped knowledge for goods. A man named Elias, part trader, part storyteller, once came with a crate of light bulbs and left with 2 tins of our wheat and a promise to return with a welder. He was careful and soft-spoken and told us, as if sharing a poem, that he'd heard of a place up north where the aquifer ran deep and tasted like old stones, not metal. He called it the Blue Well. Blue Well sounded like a fairy tale at first. Names become talismans when the world shrinks. To name something is to believe it. I put the rumor on air with a caution that felt like a confession. If you hear of a blue well, I said, check twice, check thrice. But if it's true, know this. You might have to barter more than bread for a bucket. The line lit up with murmurs. One caller, a breathless woman who said she'd been a hydrologist once, gave details of a geological formation that could, under the right conditions, hold water where other places failed. She spoke of a clay lens and a fault-line seam and a shallow salt concentration that might yield to desalination. Her voice trembled with the kind of hope you cannot prescribe. Hope is contagious and dangerous. We convened a council at dusk under a tattered awning. We mapped possibilities with chalk on plywood. The cost in days to travel, the fuel required, the manpower needed to protect a new well, the food we'd have to leave behind. If Blue Well was real, would we be strengthening ourselves or setting a beacon for the raiders? Our math was cruel. What we might gain in water could be lost in human capital if we attracted the wrong attention. Internally, my trust fractured along familiar lines. I am a storyteller by trade, and storytellers have a tendency to believe their own narrative. I wanted Blue Well to be a truth because I wanted a clean answer for why I kept the mic warm. But I also knew that radio makes maps out of words. I can send coordinates into the dark, and someone will act on them. That weight lay heavy on my shoulders. Each broadcast felt like a forked tool. It could build bridges or lay traps. The immediate threats compounded each other. Fires edged closer as the dry season prolonged, skirting the hills where some of the smaller communities lay like stitches across a wound. Smoke came earlier in the day, making it hard for the solar arrays to work at full tilt, and reducing the efficiency of our small desalination rigs. Pests multiplied with the heat. Locusts marched and ate. Beetles burrowed into the roots of experimental crops. The disease lurked in corners where the heat and crowding met. Feverish nights in the shared clinic. Someone who came from a caravan coughing with a new cough we'd never written in any elder's manual. We tried adaptation as an art form. Malik and I spent a week improvising a condenser from an old cooler and copper tubing he'd salvaged from a hospital wing. It worked enough to make a liter of water a day when nights were cool and humidity present. We learned night harvesting, digging shallow pits filled with vegetation, covering them with plastic sheeting, and collecting dew. It's slow, but it saved children from some fevers. We created a rotation schedule for the generator that cut its use by 50% and taught the community to ration light. We dug trenches and planted rows of heat-tolerant varieties June had read about in a cracked agricultural pamphlet. These small salvations felt heroic in their daily persistence, and yet the pressure box tightened. The raiders don't wait for strategy to bind us. One night in late summer they showed a new tactic. They didn't take from us directly. They followed trade routes and cut off supply at a midpoint, taking trucks full of grain before they reached our trading fair. News came through Elias repeaters like a fevered whisper. We calculated the losses: grain, tools, a welder. The caravan that had once promised us a welder was next seen with a burnt axle somewhere east. That same week, a new voice answered my call sign. She was young, maybe 20, with a cadence that suggested a training not unlike my own. Radio etiquette, voice control, the calming lie that makes strangers trust. She introduced herself as Myra and said she represented a group calling itself the River Watch. They claimed to have a working filtration bank and a caravan route that passed by a place with spring-fed wells. Myra's voice had the crispness of someone who'd learned to speak in close quarters with people who listened. She said they could share access in exchange for a small, recurring radio slot time on the air to broadcast safe route coordinates and to teach water conservation. We were skeptical. People use radio as a leash. Whoever controls the airwaves often controls behavior. On the other hand, the River Watch might be a spear aimed at our survival. We arranged a meeting at a neutral point with flags, a rusted water tower, and set a watch schedule. Malik wanted to go in force. I wanted to keep the radio as a bridge and sent Rosa to represent us. She could recognize welds, would be comfortable talking about pumps, and knew how to smell a lie. The meeting was tense. Myra arrived with 2 men and a tattered map. She showed charts, crude but plausible, and spoke of a filtration bank that had been reopened by someone with engineering skill from an old NGO. She invited us to join a caravan that would move slowly, guarded, to a spring they claimed to have secured. The chart she showed had a name written on it in careful handwriting: Glassford Spring. There was hope in the name again, but I felt the old thrum of fear. How much of this was true? How much was theater for trade? We tested them in small, radio-friendly ways. We asked for a verified signal, a code phrase they would repeat over the transmitter next week. We asked for a mechanic's manual excerpt. We asked for a proof of the salvage, an item from the spring area. In return, Myra gave us a vial of clear water that tasted faintly of iron and clay, and she promised to leave an audible signal on a specific frequency at dawn for 2 mornings in a row. It was enough to make people plan. Plans, however, invite events. A storm rolled in the day before the convoy was to leave. It was one of those storms that tasted like old chemical runoff, a smell of burnt rubber and metallic tang that made the children gag. The storm knocked out a distant generator, made the radio noisy, and put the raiders in a position of advantage. In that window they snuck into a supply cache 2 towns over, taking the welder, some spare parts, and, worst of all, an old map with marked wells. A map that, in a moment of faith, we had shared with a caravan leader as proof we were worth trusting. We read the theft like a bad omen. It felt like a betrayal, knowledge that had been shared as a currency now spent by someone else for iron and bullets. Energy in the community twisted, anger, blame, and fear making a new weather front. People began to whisper that radio invitations were traps. I felt the hand of that accusation as if it were physical. My role was a vector. I had given the space for exchange, and it had been used to steal from us. The internal struggle grew teeth. I wanted to be the person who believed in the good in others, who extended airtime and trust because humanity depends on bridges. Yet each bridge felt increasingly fragile. If I continued to give airtime to caravans and new promises, I risked more thefts. If I withdrew into silence, I risked hollowing the network that had kept us from disintegrating into scattered, lone survivors. The boundary between prudent caution and cowardice became blurry. I started to leave certain things off the air. Exact counts of fuel, precise coordinates of our cistern, the layout of defensive positions. I lied quietly in the name of survival. Lies felt like small, necessary surgeries, clean and purpose-driven. Some nights I drove myself into the dark to test rumor with a small team. We followed an old canal path toward where Elias had said Bluewell might lie. The land changed as we walked. The dust grew thicker, the buildings collapsed into ridged teeth, and the sky dimmed with smoke from distant fires. We found nothing but a dry hole and the carcass of an old pump. On our way back, we heard engines, not ours, and hid in a culvert as riders passed like a hunting party. That night we returned with nothing but the thin rope of survival and a new scar on a calf where barbed wire sought to slow us. I told the story on air, not to humiliate hope, but to remind people that rumors demand verification. Still, the small miracles kept us moving. Rosa coaxed a pump back to life with a belt cut from a truck seat and a seal fashioned from a rubber boot. A trader showed up with a pack of yeast in exchange for a night of radio time and taught us how to ferment a small batch of bread. A child in the community learned to fix the transmitter's preamp after watching us work for weeks. His fingers were quick and fearless. These are the things that give you the push to make one more plan, to answer one more caller, to schedule one more caravan run. The summer turned into a compressed season of choices. We tightened rotations, we hid caches, we trained teenagers in scouting and quiet movement. I refined my broadcast, more instruction, less rumor, and a new segment I called Checks and Balances, where listeners reported on what they saw at certain coordinates, effectively crowdsourcing verification. The line grew heavy with voices, some true, some desperate for attention. The network became a sieve for truth. As the rising action crested, the stakes were clear. Bluewell or Glassford Spring might be salvation, or they might be a graveyard for those who believed. Raiders grew more inventive. The disease took an old man in the clinic and then showed up a week later in a caravan in the next valley. Trust frayed. Our resource ledgers looked like obituaries, and the decisions we made about where to spend our fuel read like verdicts. And yet in the static of those tensions we found a rhythm. Plan, test, verify, move. It is a fragile choreography, but it is a choreography nonetheless. The radio became a metronome for that dance. I broadcast at dawn and dusk, translating rumor into data, fear into strategy, and possibility into cautious steps. The network listened. Sometimes it answered with help. Sometimes it answered with gunfire. The cliff edge of our patience moved closer every day. We had to make a choice soon. Keep broadcasting and risk luring the wrong attention, or retreat into secrecy and watch the fragile scaffolding of community collapse into isolated survival. Either choice would cost us something we were not ready to name. So we prepared. We tightened watches. We wrapped the transmitter in oilcloth in case rains came. We rehearsed evacuation paths in case the raiders returned with knowledge sharper than ours. And I, who had taught others how to test batteries and boil water, asked myself in the dark, not for the first time, whether the voice I put into the air was a map towards salvation or a flare for those who would take everything we had left. The next morning at first light, a new transmission came through on the channel we used for check-ins. A clipped voice that said only, Bluewell Beacon on 43.2, 2 cycles only, then silence. The line blinked like an eyelid. The decision to go or to listen, to trust or to hold fast, pressed down on us like the heat when noon arrives, inevitable and unforgiving. The morning the world tried to break us for good began with a sky that looked like a bruise, the kind you see on skin when someone has been holding on too long. Wind came in long and flat, carrying a taste of copper and old plastic, the chemical tang that had been our omen for months. We had scheduled the convoy to leave at dawn, the hour when the air was thin and the sun still lied about its cruelty. Rosa and Malik checked the straps on the carts. June wrapped the last bandages into a sack. I stood by the antenna with my hand on the mic like a man touching a relic. Blue Well, or Glassford Spring, or whatever honest name the place answered to, was no longer rumor. Myra had sent coordinates and a wavering recording. Clear water running under stone, a pump that a small team could bring back to life if they had parts and a plan. We had weighed the math until the numbers thinned and cut. 3 carts, 2 guarded walkers, 1 small detachment to sweep for raiders, and a protocol for what to do if the raiders came. We had decided that if the spring was real, we'd take only what we could carry and leave the infrastructure intact for others to find. Collective prudence, we told ourselves. Cooperative survival. It was the kind of plan you make when you believe people can be more than hunger in disguise. I had one other plan. Keep the radio on. If the convoy found trouble, if the raiders followed, I would speak a pattern into the air that would guide those of us who stayed back to a contingency route. The radio was a map, and a map is only useful when someone knows how to read it. I would be the reader. We moved out with the quiet protocol of people who had learned to speak softly in a house that might be full of snakes. The first day was a march through a world stitched in ash. Fence posts leaning like tired teeth, a church bell frozen mid-tilt, a playground where the swings whistled in the wind. We took the secondary roads, the ones the raiders seemed to ignore because they were slow and took patience. Our carts were laden with water barrels and the small clutch of parts that might coax a pump into life. A roll of reinforced tubing, a set of replacement bearings, a hand crank adapter Malik had welded from a grinder's guts. At dusk the first misgiving arrived. A column of smoke not from a distant burn, but from the shape of a campfire that should not have been there. We skirted down a ditch and watched men and women move like ants around a skeleton of metal, trading in the shallow gold of stolen lithium cells. A child laughed. It was a sound that made me think of my daughter and nearly unmade me. Malik wanted to charge with a shout and a thrown knife. June put a hand on his arm and said, "No, not now. We've seen what bravado costs." We held our breath until the night swallowed them and then moved on. We reached the coordinates in the small hours. Glassford would have been an anticlimax in any other story. A low basin ringed by broken shale, a pipe protruding like an old tooth. But the sound, the thin, honest trickle of water under the stone, made the whole world rearrange itself in my chest. Rosa ran her hand along the pipe and spat a curse that was almost holy. Myra arrived with 2 of her people, faces worn in the same way ours were, and they all stood for a long stretch like people in a church. The pump was stubborn, but not dead. Malik took the bearings while Rosa improvised a gasket from an inner tube. They worked in a circle that looked like prayer. June and I ran the makeshift filters, sand, charcoal, gravel, and boiled the first cups of water in a dented pot over a whispered flame. When I lifted the steam to my face, it smelled like possible futures. People laughed. Someone shouted a name. We allowed ourselves a breath of joy that tasted like a small conspiracy. The good news was sharp and immediate. The spring was real and it ran clear if treated. The bad news pressed against the edges of that moment like a black tide. The map we thought private was not. The raiders, the ones who had shadowed the trade routes for months, were quick. It may have been a leak, a whispered word, or it may have been that the noise of our engines, the light of our fire, and the trail of our carts announced us, as if the land itself were conspiring against discretion. We saw them before they saw us, a line of dust to the east and the glint of metal. We had minutes. Plans are fragile until they are not. We argued in the way people argue when the difference between life and ruin is measured in heartbeats. Take what we can and leave. Defend the spring at all costs. Move the women and children and make a run for the hidden wells we'd kept in case of failure. I remember saying nothing at first because the words felt like bullets. Then I found my voice because the radio was still in my pocket and sound is a simpler thing than decision. Station K9 to all listeners, I said into the mic, my hand steady because the microphone will make you hold your breath like a prayer. We have found water. Repeat, clean water treated Glassford Spring. 10 carts can be filled in 2 hours under manual pump. Bring only essential hands. If you hear raiders, repeat frequency 43.2. Evacuation route Delta Day is clear for 2 miles east of the old mill. I said it because it was truth. I said it because hope must be shared to be useful. I did not say it because I did not know the cost. Words travel like birds and sometimes sit in branches where they are easy prey. The raiders came sooner than any of us wanted. They arrived with the efficiency of a machine and the cruelty of a joke. They cut into our flank and moved like a shadow through the scrub, coordinating with the kind of terse signals that a practiced theft requires. There were more of them than we'd expected. They moved with a speed that made our makeshift defenses look like a child's barricade. I remember the sound, the snap of bullet casings on rock, the sharp cursing of men who had learned how to be dangerous. There was a moment in the chaos when fear makes you animal, breath short, muscles hot, and I expected to run. But the radio was there in my hand, the microphone a tether to the people we had left behind. We could lead them away. We could turn our broadcast into a flaring map that would draw attention and buy time for the convoy. Listen, I said into the mic, and my voice did not sound like mine. This is K9. Repeat. False beacon on 32.8. 2 cycles. Bluewell is on path beta, not alpha. Do not take the road by the mill. Repeat. I spat coordinates like bread to the poor. It was a lie built from necessity, a diversion to steer the attention away from the convoy as they filled their carts and pushed a heavy, slow supply of barrels up the incline. Malik and Rosa took their places, firing not to kill but to scare. We were not soldiers, and we were not trying to win a war, only to make noise enough to dissuade pursuit for a handful of minutes. I watched the convoy move like a tide, small barrels on carts, children bundled, June clutching a satchel of medicine like a hope. We lost a watchman to a brace of shots that made him fold, a noise like paper folding. I heard someone scream and then not. The world rearranged itself again, and I felt the old stone in my chest shift with it. The raid turned on us, and we turned with it. There was a point when all strategy resolved into a thin, terrible arithmetic. The generator was drawing fuel and light and attention. If we let the generator run, it would keep the pump working and we could fill more barrels. If we shut it and ran, we would risk leaving people to the dark and the terror. The generator was both lifeline and flare. If the raiders found it, they would have power and reason to stay. I thought of my daughter. I thought of my wife. I thought of names I had promised to keep alive and the people who depended on me to do so. The choice resolved itself not with cleverness, but with the bluntness of what I couldn't bear to lose, the community. I could have led those that stayed into hiding and run out alone to distract the raiders. I could have kept my voice and let the world carry us forward. Instead, I chose both, broadcast and bait. I turned the generator up, let it scream like a warning, and broadcast the most literal beacon I could make. I transmitted a repeating loop, coordinates within a half-mile radius of our location, and a plea that sounded like a prayer. My voice was smaller under the wind and the sound of gunfire, but it was honest and constant. I spoke of an easier pick, a cache at the old water tower, an undefended battery bank, a load of canned peaches that would be worth taking. I told the story in a cadence built for greed. The raiders took the lie like a moth takes heat. They moved toward the generator, and we moved with them in the way an animal leads a predator away from its young. The first scrap of the plan worked. The raiders diverted. The convoy, heavy with barrels, pushed on toward the secondary road we had scouted. We had bought minutes, and minutes were our currency. Minutes, however, are not infinite. The raiders were thorough. They sent a flanking party, and in the confusion a stray shot found June. She fell and her name left the air like a soft bruise. I ran to her and the world tunneled. June smiled at me like someone who had always known how the world might end and was tired of being polite to it. Her hand closed on mine with the stubbornness of a person who keeps tending a dying engine. "Keep the mic warm," she whispered. I pressed the microphone to my mouth because the thread of my work, the radio, the mapping of trust was all I had to give. We lost the generator that day in a way I still cannot explain without a taste of metal crawling under my tongue. Malik rammed it with a cart to stop it when the raiders had nearly cut off our retreat, and the fill valve pinched and burst. Fuel sprayed and caught. The sound of that fire was bright and immediate. We scrambled people and dragged the wounded away while bottles of diesel hissed and flamed. I saw flames lick the microphone's edge, and for a sliver of time, I gave an honest laugh that was part grief, part release. In the end, we won and we lost in the same breath. The convoy made it with 6 carts filled, not the 10 we had hoped for. We left 2 people behind because they could not move fast enough and the raiders were close. We carried them in our hearts and in our prayers. The spring remained. We had not bled it dry, but it was scarred. The raiders left behind the shape of their cruelty and the taste of metal in the mouths of those who had held watch. That night, after the smoke had settled and the children coughed but slept, I sat by the ruined generator with the mic in my lap. The plastic was melted where the flame had eaten it. I thought of the decisions that had brought us here, the broadcast that read like a bell, the warning we had given the network, the lie that saved the convoy. I thought of the man we had left behind, the 2 we had not been able to carry, and the faces of the ones who had gathered water and come back with eyes that had seen too much. I could have stayed to keep the radio alive, to keep threading voices across the wasteland. Instead, I made another choice, one as small and as human as the others. I fixed the pump by hand until my hands shook and I could not feel my fingers, and then I taught 3 young people how to do it. I left the microphone wrapped in oilcloth, an oath folded in fabric, and walked 2 miles toward the place where the convoy would come back with its barrels. My voice would be quiet for a time, and that silence felt like the cost of what we had done. The climax was not a single moment, but a cluster of them. The discovery of the spring, the raid's shadow falling over us, the lie I told into a microphone that saved lives and damned my cleanliness, the generator's bright corroding sacrifice, June's hand in mine. Each action pushed the story toward the edge, and at that edge I found myself not as a hero, but as a keeper of small things, names, promises, and the stubborn practice of sharing water when you could. As dawn bled into the next day, and the convoy returned with fewer carts but full barrels, I wrapped my daughter's drawing in a bit of oiled cloth and slipped it into my jacket. I had made choices that would sit with me for the rest of my life. I had lied to save lives. I had burned a sound into the world that would echo in the hours after. I had left the radio quiet. But when the convoy's boots thudded into camp and water changed hands like scripture, people brought me a cup. Someone, perhaps a child, perhaps a stranger who had learned to give without asking, put a hand on my shoulder and said, simply, "You kept your promise." The words landed like a small, unexpected rain. The storm that came that night was different from the raids and the heat. It was a slow, metallic rain that tasted of burned plastic and ash, and it threatened to wash away the small victory we clutched. We covered barrels, we steeled ourselves, and we buried the names of the lost under a marker of flat stone. I sat with the mic wrapped in quiet and thought about the microphone like a sleeping animal. Later, when the wind fell and the world breathed a tired hour, I would speak again, but not until I had learned the cost of speaking. The morning after, the camp smelled of boiled water and smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang that fire leaves on everything it touches. We counted what we had and what we had lost with the same careful hands we'd once used to count coins. 6 full barrels, 2 people left behind, 1 watchman gone, a generator melted into a blackened skeleton, a pump salvaged and singing patiently under a makeshift canopy. The ledger of survival added its newest entries and closed the page with a hand that trembled but kept writing. The immediate good was simple and stubborn. People drank. For the first day after Glassford, the cups ran to lips that had known the taste of boiled slush and bitter ration water. Children laughed because laughter is a cheap, effective medicine. Mothers pressed their thumbs into the backs of babies' necks and felt warmth that was not fever. The spring gave us back something the drought had stolen, a margin. We filled barrels, we patched seals, and we made plans that reached a day farther than the last. That margin, however, came with a toll. We buried June in the hollow of a hill not far from camp, marking her place with a scrap of metal hammered into the earth, and a drawing my daughter had once made folded under the rock. We performed what rituals we could muster: a circle of voices, a reading of names, a handful of dirt pressed into a small hand. June's death made a map of what we choose to protect and at what cost. People spoke less of heroism and more of arithmetic. How many lives could we risk for a chance at a pump? How many lies are allowable if they save children? Those questions lingered like the smoke, and no single answer satisfied everyone. The people we left behind haunted the edges of our evenings. We had tried to carry them. We had tried and failed. Their face names, Ram, Old Agda, arrived on the air sometimes in quiet confessions from callers who'd heard rumors of a different raider camp. We kept a file of their names, little candles in the form of memory. The guilt of leaving them was a substance that sat heavy in my chest. I carried it like a tool because guilt, when acknowledged, can be an instrument of change. It sharpens procedures, it forces rehearsal of evacuation, it makes you dig deeper for contingency. We redrafted our protocols after their loss: faster carries, better harnesses, an extra pair of hands on the slowest walkers. It was the only way to stop regret from calcifying into paralysis. Trust changed. Myra and Riverwatch, who had stood with us at Glassford, did not leave empty-handed, but neither did they stay as fully as we had hoped. There was gratitude and distance in equal measure. The caravan that had promised a welder turned up weeks later on a different road, with a story about being chased and forced to barter metal for the essentials. Elias came through once with a box of soap, and a look that suggested he'd raised his own hand in trade for survival. The network that had felt like a warm web now looked like a rope bridge, useful, but with gaps that made every crossing require thought. On the air, my voice had the same timbre but a different weight. I had lied on the mic to save lives. I had used the radio as a diversion, spun a story of a cache at the water tower so the raiders would chase the wrong bell. The lie worked. It felt like a tool, not an atrocity. But every lie has a residue. People began to ask for more verification checks. I instituted the two-call rule for any claim about movement or caches. At least 2 independent confirmations before I aired a location. We started a verification network, a series of routines where callers would report sightings, and a small team would corroborate before any firm broadcast. It slowed down the flow of rumor and saved us from a handful of traps. It also meant that sometimes, when help might have mattered, we acted late. That is the calculus: fewer mistakes, more cautious salvation. The generator's loss forced a reordering of priorities. Without it, we could not run the pump continuously, so we taught 3 young people to operate and maintain the manual hand cranks we'd fitted to the system. Rosa taught them mechanics from a page of diagrams and a cracked welder's manual. Malik taught them how to listen to bearings and feel for cavitation. The skills were small miracles, the transfer of knowledge in the place of engines. We practiced until calluses formed on palms, and until the pump's rhythm became the camp's second heartbeat. Nature did not forgive us, nor did it offer quick redemption. Around Glassford, small things began to green: moss in the shade of the spring, a few stubborn reeds, a spider that spun a web between 2 rusting pipes. Those were the gifts we treasured and exaggerated into legends. Beyond our hills, the sky kept its copper bruises. Fires still burned in the distance more often than they should. The seasons continued to misbehave. A cold snap 3 weeks after Glassford killed a batch of seedlings we'd hoped would yield enough greens to barter. Pests came in waves, some years locusts, some years beetles that turned roots to mush. The longer view was grim. The feedback loops the scientists warned about: heat, evaporation, soil loss, were not reversed by one spring. Glassford was a salve on a wound that had not yet begun to heal. Disease remained an ever-present shadow. The illness that had once been whispered about as a walking fever appeared in small, frightening ways. A caravan member with a burning forehead, a child with confusion in his eyes for a day. We tightened quarantine protocols and improved our triage. June's old ledger, the one with tabs and notations, became the camp's most consulted book. We learned to ration antibiotics more intelligently, to boil water even when the pump sang clearly, and to improvise dressings when bandages ran low. Prevention became our primary medicine. The social contract of the camp evolved. Where once generosity had been a spontaneous virtue, now it was a practice policy. We created shifts for watch and work, and consequences for those who stole from the community. Punishments were not theatrical. They were pragmatic work details, necessary reparations, and when theft endangered many, exile with a sack of basics and a clear road. The moral framing shifted from charity to mutual obligation. It kept the small society functional. It preserved more lives than any one person could have. Inside me, things changed. My earlier illusions that a single voice could stitch the world back together had been tempered into the humbler belief that voices form parts of a system. I had been a connector, yes, but connectors must also act as filters. I learned the painful beauty of containment, of knowing when silence is a shield and when speech is a sword. The radio remained my instrument and my conscience. I taped a small list next to the mic. Verify, protect, share. It is not elegant, but it guided decisions during nights thick with static and fear. Grief grew into something like purpose. I taught the young radio kid, the one with the quick fingers, to read the air for interference and to stitch code phrases into a check. We set up a modest school under the awning. How to test a battery by weight, how to patch a leaky cistern, how to make a charcoal filter from a soup can in sand. These lessons were small acts of hope. We were seeding resilience into hands that would last longer than any one person. Sometimes the past rose like a dream that woke you in the middle of the night. I would take my daughter's drawing out, smooth the edges, and listen to the paper creak like an old memory. The guilt of the decisions we made did not lessen. It reframed into action. I channeled it into improving our evacuation practice, into bartering smarter, into anonymizing certain broadcasts so they could not be used by predators. I became less naive about human goodness and more deliberate about how to broker it. We learned to celebrate without braggadocio. The day Rosa found a small cache of seeds in a burned greenhouse, and we planted them with ceremony, hands in the soil, a muted trumpet of laughter. We treated the event like a holiday. It was small, ridiculous, and wholly necessary. We recorded the date and the cheers. We named the seedlings June's Greens and watched them with obsessive pride. At night, when the generator was down and the stars were dimmed by smoke, I would wrap the microphone in oilcloth and place it by my cot like something fragile I had to keep warm. The radio was quiet for longer stretches now, but when it spoke, it carried less rumor and more usefulness. Instructions, verification, and the names of people who needed help. We made it a policy to never broadcast precise caches or troop formations. We shared routes only when we had corroboration. We had learned that information, like water, must be rationed and cared for. Hope persisted in smaller forms. A caravan found a battery bank upstream and traded it for a week's worth of hands. A child who had never seen meat in months bit into a piece of dried jerky as if it were a revelation. A woman in a distant valley tuned her receiver and, hearing our checks, laughed over a joke she'd heard years ago and transmitted it back. Those small interactions became the scaffolding of a fragile optimism. As the season turned, we planned for the long haul rather than the immediate sprint. We built redundancy into the pump system, teaching 3 different ways to run it. We dug a secondary catch basin and fenced it. We set up a scheduled caravan rotation to trade knowledge for parts, and we created radio windows that were intentionally vague. A shared frequency where people could call with code phrases to request aid without exposing locations. The network had become less about instantaneous broadcasting and more about durable, low bandwidth usefulness. I still dream sometimes of the world before, of pale blue skies that were simply sky and not a commentary. The longing is not rational, it is human. But the new world had given me other dreams too, of a small town with a pump that never quits, of children who know how to fix things, of a voice that is a tool for safety rather than a siren for theft. The cost we paid at Glassford will follow me forever. The faces of the ones we lost are etched in the margins of my broadcasts. I do not think of myself as absolved, I think of myself as accountable. In the small hours when the camp settles and the radio hums low, I take out my daughter's drawing and speak softly into the empty mic. It is not broadcast, it is a private ritual. I say the names of those who died, the names of those who were saved, and the names of those we left. I say them because words keep the dead near and the living honest. Then I wrap the microphone back in oilcloth and sleep, because to keep speaking tomorrow, I must be alive today. We have hope, narrowly defined and seasoned by loss. Nature is not healed, but it is not entirely done with us either. The spring is a place where life can be coaxed, not a cure. Our community is smaller, perhaps wiser, certainly more guarded. My voice is steadier, more careful. I learned that survival is not a single blow of triumph, but a series of small recoveries. A pump fixed, a wound dressed, a child who laughs. When I finally speak into the air again, it is with the humility of someone who has seen the cost of a word. I start with names. I start with a check. If you can hear me, say your name and your distance. That is how we rebuild, line by line, not with grand promises, but with incremental trust and the practice of keeping the mic warm. The world does not offer tidy endings. It offers thin, stubborn continuations. Mornings you earn one breath at a time, and small victories that feel obscene in their modesty. After Glassford and the ashes and the people we could not carry, I learned the lesson that survival is not a single heroic act, but the accumulation of tiny mercies. We patched a pump, taught 3 hands to keep it turning, planted a few seeds we called June's greens, and buried names under flat stones. Those acts do not fix the sky. They only buy us another day to try. I carry the weight of choices like a tool belt. Some of those choices left blood on my hands, and I will not pretend otherwise. I lied on the air because lies sometimes save lives. I left people behind because the march could not carry the whole world at once. I watched the generator burn and thought of all the times engines had kept more than machines alive. They kept networks, trust, and promises. Guilt is a companion now. It sits with me when the camp settles and makes me honest. It sharpens the way I teach the young ones how to test a battery, how to stitch a wound, how to read a rumor before it becomes a trap. But I also carry a ledger of small grace. When a child drinks clear water from a cup that does not taste of metal, the world cracks open for a bright second. When a trader with rough hands shows up and trades a welder for a week of airtime, and returns with parts that make the pump sing, the math of survival tips in favor of life for a moment. When a voice on the radio remembers a joke from the old world and laughs, that laughter moves through the static and lands in a place that was almost numb. Those moments are not cures. They are scaffolding. They teach us how to keep building. We set rules now. We verify twice before broadcasting a cache. We never give precise defensive layouts. We ration not only water and fuel, but also information. It feels cruel to ration human things, but we learn that words can be as dangerous as bullets when used without care. The radio remains sacred because it stitches people together. It is also a tool that can open holes in the hull if misused. So we measure our speech the way we measure bleach, carefully, in small drops that do the job without poisoning. Nature continues to mock our insistence on quick fixes. The bruise-colored sky hangs on some days like a permanent curtain. Fires still flicker in distant ridges and sometimes come too close. Pests and odd new diseases remind us that ecosystems are changing, and we are late to the lesson plan. Yet life persists in jealous little places. A reed that found purchase by the spring moss in the shade of a ruined pump, seedlings that sprout stubbornly from a seed we thought burned. Those things are not miracles in the biblical sense. They are evidence that resilience is not reserved for the past. It is present, small and practical. Inside me, the shape of who I was has shifted. I used to believe a single voice could stitch the world whole. Now I know a network of voices, cautious and verified, can hold a town together. I am less the heroic narrator and more the quiet librarian of what matters. Names, procedures, contacts. I teach the radio kid not to speak unless the words will move something useful. I teach the young mechanics to test for cavitation before a pump dies. I teach the watchers to look for patterns, not panic. Those lessons are my legacy now, more than any broadcast that once made strangers feel less alone for an hour. There are nights when the past comes back like an old song. I take out my daughter's drawing, the edges singed but her son's still too full of rays, and I speak quietly into the wrapped microphone, so the words do not go anywhere but into the fabric of my keeping. I name the people we lost. I name the ones we saved. I whisper the small, necessary promises I made and failed to keep. Ritual keeps the dead near and the living honest. It is an odd, private ministry. Hope in this world is a deliberate act. It does not look like the grand proclamations of pamphlets and politicians. It looks like a seed tucked into new soil, a pump seal held together by a slice of inner tube, a verification call that prevents a massacre. It is the stubborn practice of doing the next useful thing. It is sometimes ugly. It demands compromise. It asks for lies that are strategic and truths that are slow to tell. It requires us to be accountable to each other in ways our old systems never taught us, to trade fairly, to watch, to teach, and to conduct funerals that are honest and thorough. So what is my final message? I suppose it is both a plea and an instruction. If you are listening, if your receiver is tuned and your heart is steady enough to take the truth, hear me plainly. Keep your mic warm. Say your name when you can. Verify what you hear twice before you act. Share water when it will save a child, and do not be ashamed to ask for help. Teach what you know and write it down in a place that can be handed to another pair of hands. Build redundancy into everything. 2 pumps, 3 ways to start a fire, 4 people who can fix a belt. When you must lie to save lives, do it with the weight of someone who knows the cost. When you can tell the truth, do so with as much clarity as you can muster. Remember names. Bury the dead properly. Laugh when you can. Plant something and tell the young what to do with it in summer. We will not return everything that was lost. The sky will not become the indifferent blue of childhood overnight. There will be more storms, more thefts, more nights when the generator will cough its last. But there will also be mornings when a bowl of clear water makes a child fall asleep with a clean mouth and a lighter breath. There will be days when June's greens produce a head of bitter, brave lettuce that feeds 6 people and creates a memory that outlives hunger. Those are not small things in a world that has been pared to essentials. So keep going, not as a hymn to heroism, but as an insistence on the ordinary work of survival, mending, teaching, verifying, sharing, naming. Keep your promises small enough to be kept and large enough to matter. Keep the mic warm, not because sound is magic, but because sound is how we remember that we are not alone. I do not know what tomorrow will bring. I only know the shape of the work ahead and the people I will do it with. I will keep peddling watts into a tired generator when I must, and teach 3 more hands to do the same. I will keep the microphone wrapped and ready, and I will keep saying names into the dark until someone answers, until a string of voices runs long enough to make a rope. Stay alive, stay human, keep your mic warm.